History as it happens, May 23, 2023. King Socialism.
Poor black and white are still perishing on a lonely island of poverty in the midst of a vast ocean of material prosperity.
It seems to me that the civil rights movement must now begin to organize for the guaranteed annual income, begin to organize.
The poor, white and Negro, bear the heaviest burden. We are dealing with issues that cannot be solved without the nation spending billions of dollars.
For they tell me that 1/10 of 1% of the population controls more than 50% of the wealth. Oh, America, how you've taken necessities from the masses to give luxuries to the classes.
Martin Luther King criticized capitalism, said poverty was a moral crime. He called for redistribution of wealth and government programs to aid the poor. King considered himself a democratic socialist, an aspect of his civil rights philosophy overlooked today, as Americans endlessly reckon with race and racism in our history, culture, and politics. It's time to restore King Socialism. Next, as we report history as it happens, a podcast from the Washington Times. I'm Martin DeCaro.
He tends to be frozen in the political culture as a Southern civil rights leader, arguing for fairness and non-discrimination, colorblindness. His associates ever since have been trying to point out that he was as centrally concerned with ending class inequality and war as he was with ending racism.
What comes to mind when you think of Martin Luther King, the orator, the civil rights champion? Probably this.
I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal.
1963, the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. King's call for racial harmony and an end to racial discrimination echoes to this day.
That one day on the red hills of Georgia, sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners will they be able to sit down together at the table.
Less well known, less frequently quoted is a sermon King delivered in the mid-1950s, where he assumes St. Paul's voice in Paul's letter to American Christians.
For they tell me that 1/10 of 1% of the population controls more than 50% of the wealth. Oh, America, how you've taken necessities from the masses to give luxuries to the classes. Your capitalism can be used very well. You can use it to wipe poverty from the face of the earth. You can use it to lift the whole level of humanity. You can lift it to make mankind come to the point that it is destined to come to. Your wealth can be used to a noble end. You have it at your disposal. Use it for that, America.
He said God never intended for a group of people to live in superfluous, inordinate wealth while others live in abject, deadening poverty. Well, that kind of talk will get you called a socialist today, at least on Fox News anyway. But why is it during our time of yawning income inequality and persistently low levels of private sector union membership, recent positive headlines notwithstanding, this part of King's philosophy is ignored if people are even aware of it? Maybe not among activists, but among the general public who admires the man today.
Now, one of the answers, it seems to me, is a guaranteed annual income, a guaranteed minimum income for all people and for all families of our country.
Martin Luther King had serious problems with capitalism. He wanted the federal government to spend billions of dollars to eradicate poverty, just as Congress passed the Homestead Act of 1862. It gave 160 acres of federal land to anyone who agreed to farm it, and this helped millions of individual settlers, and no one called it welfare.
And now that they have succeeded in becoming successful, they are paid not to farm. And these are the same people who now say to black people whose ancestors were brought to this country in chains and who were emancipated in 1863 without being given land to cultivate or bread to eat, that they must pull themselves up by their own bootstraps. What they truly advocate is socialism for the rich and capitalism for the poor.
I guess it's understandable that after the 1619 Project, which came out in 2019, and after the Black Lives Matter protests the following summer, that racial injustice would still soak up so much attention. It's not hard to find people on Twitter with large follower counts blaming just about everything on white supremacy. So it is a bit easy to forget that our country briefly reckoned with class about 12 years ago. The Occupy Wall Street protests, or here in Washington, Occupy K Street. And I remember covering those demonstrations as a reporter and the chants of "We are the 99%." And Senator Bernie Sanders, probably more than any other American politician, has mainstream socialist-sounding issues like universal health care, free college tuition, higher taxes on the wealthy, the kinds of policies that poll well among younger voters.
So let me take this opportunity to define for you, simply and straightforwardly, what democratic socialism means to me. It means building on what Franklin Delano Roosevelt said when he fought for guaranteed economic rights for all Americans. And it builds on what Martin Luther King Jr. said in 1968 when he stated, and I quote, "This country has socialism for the rich and rugged individualism for the poor," end of quote.
And King himself understood the connection between white supremacy, or Jim Crow, and class. That's why he called C. Vann Woodward's The Strange Career of Jim Crow the historical Bible of the civil rights movement, something I'll be discussing in a moment. So it is strange, then, when Americans remember the most iconic civil rights leader in our history, they mostly ignore what King had to say about capitalism, although he said it throughout the 1950s and 60s. I mean, I've only played a small sample of his speeches here. You can listen to them all day online, where he's talking about capitalism and poverty and materialism, all the way up to the day he was assassinated in 1968. Thomas Jackson is a historian at the University of North Carolina, Greensboro, and he's the author of From Civil Rights to Human Rights, Martin Luther King Jr. and the Struggle for Economic Justice. Thomas Jackson, welcome.
It's great to be here. Thank you for inviting me, Martin.
So do you agree with my general premise that Martin Luther King's legacy, his philosophy, his life's work is simplified, oversimplified, sanitized, or maybe just looked at in too narrow a fashion these days?
Yeah, absolutely. He tends to be frozen in the political culture as a Southern civil rights leader arguing for fairness and non-discrimination, colorblindness. His associates ever since have been trying to point out that he was as centrally concerned with ending class inequality and war as he was with ending racism. Why that happened is a fascinating story. I think that at the time, the media and the administration were focusing on the consensus elements of his agenda and actively kind of suppressing the more radical demands, even at the March on Washington.
So even back in the 60s, this was happening.
Yeah, I think the kind of amnesia that is much lamented these days is rooted in how King was processed through white America at the time. The March on Washington was touted as a great achievement for American democracy and something President Kennedy said with which we should be justly proud. And then for years and years, you get the endless repetition of King's dream as a dream where his children will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character.
Yeah, the I Have a Dream speech is the clip we all see over and over and over again. That was in 1963, so we get the 60th, or no, 70th? 60th.
60th, yeah.
You can tell I was a math major. The 60th anniversary of that speech coming up, but as you said, there's so much more to it. Even then, as I was preparing to talk to you and connect with you on the call, I was listening and watching to Dr. King's speeches online. There's no question that he talked about these issues then, right from the beginning of his public career. This isn't something that he came around to, redistribution of wealth, economic justice, socialism, later in life. It was there from the beginning.
Yes, that's kind of the thesis of my 400-page book, trying to go back to his youth and education to see the roots of whatever you call it. He called it much more frequently democratic socialism later in life, although he was heavily influenced by the Black social gospel movement and by the labor movement and by the broad popular front of the 1930s.
He said the social gospel movement.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. Going back to the late 19th century, a reform movement of ministers in the progressive era that, well, when he was at theological seminary, he was heavily influenced by a guy named Walter Rauschenbusch, whose book Christianity in Crisis was broadly influential in white and Black religious circles. And it is a full-throated indictment of how war is an instrument of capitalism and privilege, and how capitalism is mystified by individualism. It's a call for a kind of Christian communal commonwealth. His grandfather and his father founded Ebenezer Baptist Church. He grew up in the Great Depression, looking at bread lines circling around the church. The church was heavily involved in social provision, in daycare for working mothers, in feeding people. It was an activist church concerned with bringing the kingdom to earth and of salvation in the here and now.
So you said that there was this whitewashing of him even during his life. And then, we have a national holiday. I guess that was made law in what? Well, 1980s, during the Reagan administration.
In America in the 50s and 60s, one of the important crises we faced was racial discrimination. The man whose words and deeds in that crisis stirred our nation to the very depths of its soul was Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr.
In a sense, that makes sense, because it's hard to imagine that in our country we would have a national holiday to someone who considered himself a socialist or a democratic socialist, or would so thoroughly denounce the excesses of capitalism here in capitalist America, right?
I think that it was a kind of Faustian bargain. The King family and the veterans of the movement in the late 60s and 70s pushing the idea of a King holiday. They themselves did not necessarily, in testifying before Congress, for example, highlight his labor activism or his opposition to the Vietnam War. So there was kind of an implicit bargain to focus on the more consensus king, and the king that the country believed at the time had ushered in a colorblind America, the myth that racism, in fact, had been relegated to the past, and that we should credit King with that achievement, rather than understanding that King focused for much of his life on things that have not yet been achieved.
It's very easy to celebrate the end of legal segregation, the end of legal disenfranchisement, 1964, 1965, the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, because, no one's going to disagree with you about that today, or at least I would hope not, right? But these other things that he called for, like a universal basic income, well, those are much more controversial. We'll get to that in a moment. So you referenced earlier how King grew up in the Great Depression, social gospel, his father and grandfather were very much involved in this. So he attends, Boston University? Help me out here. I'm missing.
He spent 6 years in predominantly white theological institutions. First, for 2 years at Crozer Theological Seminary outside of Philadelphia, and then Boston University School of Theology.
In the 50s, and that's where he starts.
1949 to 1954. Yeah.
Okay, so what were his influences in those years?
They were varied and they were profound. He never left the Black Baptist preaching circuit throughout those years, but he was heavily influenced by advisors like George Davis, who had come up in a labor union family, a white guy. His dissertation was on Paul Tillich, a European socialist Jew. And you see in his readings, I read every book he read in graduate school, and you see a consistent theme there. He incorporated some of that rhetoric into his sermonizing and his speech making as well. He read Howard Thurman. He knew Howard Thurman at Boston. Howard Thurman wrote a book called Jesus and the Disinherited. Jesus was a revolutionary, he said, and the imperative to minister the gospel to the poor included liberation, an end to poverty, hunger, homelessness. This was something his father had touted from the pulpit as well. But as I mentioned Walter Rauschenbusch before, I've got some great quotes here, if you have time for that.
Yeah, please.
Okay, Daddy King, his father, in 1940, right after he goes to seminary, he's quoting Luke 4:18, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me. He hath anointed me to preach the gospel to the poor." Daddy King said, "The ministers have to speak for the brokenhearted, the poor, the unemployed, the captive, the blind, the bruised. How can people be happy without jobs, food, shelter, and clothes?" This notion that preachers should be concerned with what King and Jesus called the least of these is a thread running throughout his ministry, from his very first sermons to his very last.
And we talk about influences. King spoke from the Bible. I mean, he was a minister.
Yeah.
Always.
Yeah. So there's a very, very strong strain of egalitarian and, in fact, revolutionary thought. Jesus is a poor carpenter, and he's promising deliverance. I think that it can't be downplayed to the influence of the Howard University School of Theology. There are a number of Gandhian Christians coming out of that heavily influenced King, men by the name of Mordecai Johnson, again, Howard Thurman. And they give him this sort of broad perspective on the world, that inequality in the world is defined by political disempowerment or political domination, colonialism, by racial segregation and oppression, and by economic exploitation. So that's the sort of evil triad that he comes back to again and again. He very much internalizes that.
Racism, materialism, militarism, right?
That's right. Racism, segregation, materialism, capitalism, political domination, colonialism, imperialism. That's the source, maybe in many ways, of his opposition to the Vietnam War. He came to see that as an imperial war. But going back to his education, it's 6 years in seminary, and a lot of people are aware of the letter that he wrote to his fiancée, Coretta King, saying, "I'm sure you know I'm more socialistic in my thinking than capitalistic." He had just read the 19th century novelist Edward Bellamy, Looking Backward. Really is a sharp critique of competitive capitalism and the promise of a commonwealth where everything is shared equally and all live in service rather than in selfish, profit-motivated ways.
Did King want to overthrow or end capitalism, or did he want to make capitalism reformed or reform capitalism?
That's a great question. He's much more concrete later in his life. As an intellectual, he didn't have to think very deeply about political processes or coalition until he's a movement leader. And so it's very much an evolutionary socialism. He thinks it can happen within the framework of political democracy. He faces throughout the 50s intense pressures to repudiate communism, and he does, calls it crippling totalitarianism, and to not be publicly identified with socialism. So you can find quotes where he says, "We need a radical redistribution of wealth in this country, but I don't necessarily endorse a socialistic economy." You can find that in the 50s and early 60s. Later on in the mid-60s and late 60s, whenever he mentions, we need to embrace democratic socialism, and here's what it looks like, he was often doing it in private meetings that were being tape recorded with fellow strategists or people who were intimate with him. So he was aware of this anti-communist crusade throughout his life, and he tried to modulate that. It was not a full-throated open call for revolutionary transformation.
You read every book King read?
Pretty much, yes, as a graduate student. And then he didn't have much time later on to read, but I read all his correspondence, all his speeches and sermons that existed when I was researching the book. More and more are coming out as we discover audio tapes.
So then you would know what his influences were.
Yeah, the broad outlines of his thought are pretty clear in my mind.
Reinhold Niebuhr?
He's profoundly influenced by Niebuhr at Boston University. Niebuhr was critical of the social gospel. He didn't believe it was possible to perfect society, to bring the kingdom down to earth. But Niebuhr spent 15 years or so in a poor neighborhood in Detroit as a socialist preacher, saying things that really are echoed directly in King, that privileged classes never give up their privileges without struggle. And he's talked specifically about Black America, how they need to use the weapon of the boycott and they need to join with the strengthening labor movement and align their interests with underprivileged or working class people. It's in the books that King read of Niebuhr.
So we're talking about King and his embrace of, we'll call it democratic socialism, which is certainly not a Marxist or a Leninist ideology as it's practiced in, say, Europe, right? King and his socialist or democratic socialist or his economic outlook, that's neglected today. His anti-war stance is often overlooked. We certainly don't neglect or overlook his views on racism and the need for racial harmony. But really what's important here is that he saw all of these things as interrelated. It wasn't just a fight against racism. It was a fight against, well, the excesses of capitalism or poverty, inequality, the damage that capitalism can do to the fabric of society as he saw it. I mean, that's sometimes a difficult message to get across to people, but King did have a really compelling way of talking about it. He said, one of many of the quotes that we can find on this, what good is it if you're allowed to sit at the lunch counter, but you can't afford the hamburger? That's just one, as I said, of many different ways where he was able to articulate these ideas, what I guess is now called intersectionality.
Yeah. Where the rubber hits the road concretely in the 50s and 60s, it had to do with nurturing an alliance with progressive labor unions. He didn't always call himself a democratic socialist. He spoke to vastly different audiences and adopted their vernacular. He's often very praising of European-style social democracy openly, or of the so-called Negro Labor Alliance. That's the main thread, and that was the main vehicle through which he thought that the economy could be made more just. His lifelong stress, policy-wise, was we need full employment, which was a dream of many of the liberals who were left of the New Deal in the 1940s. They didn't get their agenda, full employment, passed. So many of his policy goals are almost identical with those left-wing New Dealers, right, whose unfinished agenda for social insurance and full employment was not realized in the 1940s.
What was FDR's second Bill of Rights or something like
exactly.
that?
Yeah. You can find almost identical statements. What good is a hamburger in a desegregated restaurant if you can't afford to pay the bill? Incidentally, that notion, that trope was widely voiced in the movement before King said it. And that goes to something that I tried to achieve in my book, to what degree King is reflecting trends within the movement. What made King possible in terms of a mass movement, and how do we read him and read the movement through him as he's trying to channel the messages to different audiences, especially to mass audiences and to white middle-class America, who hold the strings of power.
That's critical analysis, because he didn't just direct the current, he swam in a current of thought.
He never started any of the campaigns that he joined and lent his prestige to. He said in the 50s, I'm a symbol. People are going to be expecting me to pull rabbits out of my hat after this miracle of Montgomery. He knew he was telegenic. He knew he was a worldwide celebrity, got the Nobel Prize and Times Man of the Year. And he knew that the press would follow him wherever he went. So he lent his prestige and his resources to local movements. The students of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, in many ways, were two steps ahead of King in terms of going to jail without posting bail, in terms of envisioning a rural political revolution in the South, in terms of opposing the Vietnam War. Their embrace of Black power was not his. He always remained nonviolent, but he was heavily influenced by Black power ideas. And you can find him, especially in urban contexts in the North or in the context of police violence, you can find him really echoing Malcolm X.
That was just in the news, actually, where years ago something was misquoted. Did you see that controversy?
No.
Oh, okay. Maybe we'll get back to that a little bit later. You can check it out after we're done, because I'm not quite ready to ask you about that anyway.
Let me take it back to the first speech he made as a social movement leader.
Yeah.
The Holt Street Baptist Church address of December 1955, after Black Montgomery had withdrawn its patronage from the buses. There are thousands of people listening. he puts it in world historical context. He said, your grassroots revolt is part of a global revolution. But he says two really important things. He says, your tradition of protest is the American tradition, and it's the tradition of labor trampled over by capitalistic power. That's one element. Later in the speech, he says, we need to remind the world that it was Black people who injected new meanings of democracy into Western democracy. So there is always this dual attention to a labor alliance and class inequality, and it's strengthening and empowering Black America. And that involved working with middle-class Blacks across class lines within Black America. So that intersectionality that you mentioned very practically had to do with the constituencies that he was trying to fuse, bring together, move along.
Before I move on, I'll just to clarify what I asked you about before so I don't leave our listeners hanging. There is a new biography of King written by Jonathan Eig, or Egg, it's E-I-G is his last name.
Sure.
Where he undercuts the long-held idea or belief that King had criticized Malcolm X. A quote that appeared in a Playboy magazine interview many years ago apparently was not accurate or something like that. Folks listening can look that up for themselves. So 1955, he gives that speech. He's in his mid-20s there. 1959, he gets involved with a labor dispute at a New York City hospital. He wasn't a union leader, but you could call him a labor activist here. Talk a little bit about that 1959 hospital dispute and how that all falls into his philosophy or outlook about the problems with capitalism.
He joined picket lines and basically protest marches. He lent his voice to labor struggles throughout the 50s and 60s. He disappointed some of the more militant Black labor leaders in terms of not showing up. But he did show up to Local 1199's hospital strike, 3,000 hospital workers. And Malcolm X is there. And very importantly, the kind of dean of Black protest, A. Philip Randolph, is there. And they're talking about how is it that workers can't make enough to afford the health insurance that the people who go to the hospital they work in can afford. That comes back to him. The New York labor left, the interracial labor left, and the Chicago labor left are intimately involved. They're his first supporters in the Montgomery bus boycott, and they stick with him throughout his career. And those are interracial unions. And he reciprocates. He brings his prestige and his voice.
He wanted to build a multiracial working class movement, which brings me to my next point, my next question. Nowadays, and I'll be generalizing here, and I'm not sure I'm even right about this, but if you spend any amount of time online, activists, especially post-2020 and the murder of George Floyd, white supremacy has become like a one-size-fits-all answer to every problem, or an explanation to any type of inequality today. As most economic measures will indicate, why do African Americans still lag behind white Americans in so many categories, right? But in King's day, and he called a book written by C. Vann Woodward, which I'm holding right here. The title of the book is The Strange Career of Jim Crow. King called this the historical Bible of the civil rights movement because white supremacy, Jim Crow, was a means to an end. It was real, of course. White supremacy wasn't a phantom. It was racism. But it was also a way of papering over or distracting from class divisions, inequality among whites. So why don't you address that dynamic? It wasn't just about race. It was about class, too. I guess that's a simpler way of putting my very long-winded question.
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't think it was totally overlooked and is totally overlooked today. I think King understood world capitalism and white supremacy as so interconnected that you couldn't uproot one without uprooting the other. So I wouldn't downplay his anti-racist agenda. Later in life, he said, this is a country that dispossessed Indians, that enslaved Africans, and is now fighting Vietnamese. And all of those, what do they have in common, are people of color. And he goes on to say, why is it doing it? To protect its world markets and its privileges. He was heavily influenced by C. Vann Woodward. It was common truth in the civil rights movement that after Reconstruction, white supremacy in the South was built on a divided working class. And when populism, an alliance between black and white farmers and workers, rose up, it was violently suppressed. And after that, you get the disenfranchisement of almost all blacks, but a huge proportion of working class whites. When King arrives at Montgomery, Alabama, after the famous Selma to Montgomery March, you can read that speech, and it is the kind of Woodward analysis. He says, white supremacy or segregation is a political project, and white workers were fed marginal material privileges. They're given access to some jobs, but they're also frightened into believing that blacks were out to take their jobs. And the psychological wage, he says, that this false sense of superiority in an attempt to cement a cross-class alliance between the white bourgeoisie and the white working class. And he said that was, in many respects, successful, but it never thoroughly suppressed these traditions of cross-racial lines among workers. The coal miners are a great example of that. The upsurge of industrial unionism in the 1930s, the meat packers who are huge backers of King. And so white supremacy, as it's understood today, I don't think that those who oppose white supremacy are all blind to class inequality, especially those involved in the trade union movement. The working class is, and now even more, and has always been multiracial and, involving a lot of women. So
maybe the stuff I see on Twitter is having too much of an impact on my.
Well, I went to the 50th anniversary of the March on Washington. You mentioned that, and I heard all sorts of things. I heard a heavy denunciation of police violence, appropriately so, because it was right after Trayvon Martin. But I also heard some of the representatives of the agricultural unions and the home health care workers. And they were recalling the dream of a cross-racial class alliance for raising the minimum wage at the 63 March on Washington. Yeah. So the left is very diverse. Yes, on Twitter, the discourse of solely focusing on white supremacy or explaining all the other inequalities in terms of the dominance of white supremacy, that might be asserting itself now, but I think there are a lot of people who realize that you need to fight on a number of fronts, and you need to fight together.
We live at a time when people, working class, at places like Starbucks, Amazon, of all races and ethnicities, would like to join unions. And
those are interracial efforts. And involving, crucially as well, women. His agenda to involve and include women in the social democratic agenda was not very advanced at the time. And today, it's much more essential to take gender inequality into account. You're absolutely right.
Yeah. 1967, the year before King is assassinated, he gives a speech. This is my favorite King speech at the Riverside Church in New York City. He comes out in a ringing denunciation of the Vietnam War.
There is at the outset a very obvious and almost facile connection between the war in Vietnam and the struggle I and others have been waging in America. A few years ago, there was a shining moment in that struggle. It seemed as if there was a real promise of hope for the poor, both black and white, through the poverty program. Then came the build-up in Vietnam, and I watched the program broken as if it was some idle political plaything of a society gone mad on war. And I knew that America would never invest the necessary funds or energies in rehabilitation of its poor, so long as adventures like Vietnam continue to draw men and skills and money like some demonic, destructive suction tube. And you may not know it, my friends, but it is estimated that we spend $500,000 to kill each enemy soldier. while we spend only $53 for each person classified as poor.
My takeaway from this, and this also should resonate today, you can't have guns and butter.
Yeah, absolutely. This is something that he predicted might happen in 1964 when the war on poverty was declared, that this kind of militaristic distraction might draw political attention away. That is a powerful speech. Incidentally, it was written by Black theologian Vincent Harding in collaboration with King's associate Andrew Young. And it is one of the most radical speeches, not only in terms of opposing the Vietnam War, but of trying to identify with the sufferings of the Vietnamese and to raise their cause to the level of a world war on poverty. So the internationalism is there.
As I have walked among the desperate, rejected, and angry young men, I have told them that Molotov cocktails and rifles would not solve their problems. But they ask, and rightly so, what about Vietnam? They ask if our own nation wasn't using massive doses of violence to solve its problems. And I knew that I could never again raise my voice against the violence of the oppressed in the ghettos without having first spoken clearly to the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today, my own government.
But yes, that is a moment when the budget for the war on poverty had been frozen since late 1965, and all the expectations of what this program might evolve into were dashed. In 1964, he returns from his Nobel Prize in Oslo, Norway in December, saying, it's a great war on poverty, but it's only $2 billion, and that's a drop in the bucket. And we want to see this thing really make good on its promise. The most consistent critique, even before Vietnam, drew political and resources away from domestic, the Great Society. King was saying that you cannot achieve equality without assuring much more widespread employment. And if that involves public employment, so be it. But from the outset, he envisioned a tenfold increase in the poverty budget, direct employment of unemployed workers, and a whole sort of series of reforms to welfare and Social Security that brought poor people into a national framework of income security. And all of those dreams from 1964 are delayed. And they're delayed not only by Vietnam, but by summer after summer of urban revolt, urban conflict against police violence. What you're quoting is a moment when he's talking about his shattered dreams. He still has dreams, but they really involve not only reviving, but reforming and extending that war on poverty. He was very critical of the war on poverty as it existed before he was opposed to the Vietnam War, in that it didn't really involve poor people as much as he hoped. It was not integrated, and it didn't directly employ people. But you're right. By the time Vietnam is spending about $29 billion a year, just in Vietnam, that's not the whole military budget, the war on poverty is at $1.5 billion and shrinking.
He said something like the war on poverty was shot down in the fields of Vietnam. I'm paraphrasing here. As he got older, his language grew sharper, right? Or more radical is one way of putting it.
More anti-militarist. He saw the widespread violence and the victimization, as he saw it, of Vietnamese civilians. That drew howls of protest from mainstream news organizations, white liberals, and a lot of black liberals and moderates opposed him on that one, too. He said that the United States is experimenting with new weapons the way Nazis experimented with weapons.
Yeah.
So the militancy is definitely on a higher level.
I'm glad you brought that up again, because sorry to interject, Thomas, but we talked earlier about how it's very easy today to love King and to quote him on the holiday, right, and talk about I Have a Dream. He was a polarizing, if you will, or unpopular figure with a lot of people during his time. We often forget that, and it's because of statements like these that I happen to agree with, hopefully would have agreed with them at the time had I been alive.
Yeah. It's not necessary to agree with everything he says to appreciate that his anti-militarism and his dream of a more equal and non-racial America is a dream we all should strive for. He, in his context, was trying to compete with the Black Power movement, whose rhetoric was very strident, and trying to find a nonviolent solution to summer after summer of urban rebellion. And his last dream was not necessarily to involve millions of poor people in the anti-Vietnam War movement, but to directly bring thousands and thousands of poor people to Washington, D.C. in the Poor People's March on Washington to pressure the federal government to make good on the promises of a war on poverty, and thereby to make some choices between guns and butter and to wind down the Vietnam War. That was his final organizing principle after months and months of some frustration in the anti-war movement, which was a time dominated by whites.
Yeah, I have an unofficial list of the riots in the United States in the mid to late 1960s. I count in 66, there were 4. In 67, 3, 6, 9, or 8 or 9. And then in 68, after he was assassinated, of course, right here in D.C., we saw neighborhoods burned down, and it took generations for those to be rebuilt again. So he saw the civil rights movement as a starting point. Ending legal segregation, ending disenfranchisement was not the end point. It was a starting point, because then he moves on to something called the Poor People's Campaign. This is his last campaign of his life. He's assassinated, actually, when he's down, I guess it was in Memphis, trying to help sanitation workers get collective bargaining rights.
That's right.
What was the Poor People's Campaign?
Poor People's Campaign was a dream that he had of replicating the March on Washington coalition, bring in labor, bring in sympathetic liberals, the unemployed, the unhoused, bring them to Washington as a visible example of the moral crime of poverty in America, and engage there in massive civil disobedience, which they didn't do in the first March on Washington. The notion by then was that you're having so many urban rebellions that are disrupting so much and alienating so many hitherto white supporters that you've got to have a nonviolent, something as effective as a so-called riot, and that has to be nonviolent. So it was a bold dream. It was a dream that would have taken extraordinary organizational resources and courage. It did happen, but the effort kind of got bogged down in the tent city that they built on the Washington Mall. So they didn't have wave after wave of civil disobedience in the agencies of the executive branch or in Congress.
He saw poverty as not just an unfortunate side effect that was temporary in capitalism, right? And then with each generation, people could climb out of it. Although, of course, that does happen. I don't want to say that people are permanently stuck in poverty. But what was his view of that? You said it was like a moral crime.
Yeah. Early on, his poverty rhetoric is, how can we be such an affluent society and still have 40 million people who are hungry or are insecurely employed? Poverty is a lonely island in the vast sea of material prosperity. That's his early metaphor. Later on, he says, poverty is a prison. It is maintained by privileged classes to keep people down and to profit from them. His view of poverty became much more akin to what you might read today from Matthew Desmond, that poverty is a result of how more privileged people profit from low wages. If I could read a quote from
Yes, please.
1966, he's involved in the Chicago Freedom Movement. It's not a labor organization. Many wanted him to engage in labor organizing. It's basically around fair housing in Chicago, and they're marching on suburban neighborhoods. But he writes in The Nation magazine, we've got to rethink poverty as something that is systemic and that requires actual money and resources. He says slums with hundreds of thousands of living units are not eradicated as easily as lunch counters or buses are integrated. Jobs are harder to create than voting rolls. It's easy to conceive of a plan to raise the minimum wage and thus in a single stroke extract millions of people from poverty. But between the conception and the realization, there's a formidable wall. Someone's been profiting from the low wages of Negroes. Depressed living standards for Negroes are a structural part of the economy. Certain industries are based on the supply of low-wage, underskilled, and immobile, non-white labor. Hand assembly factories, hospitals, service industries, housework, agricultural operations using itinerant labor would all suffer shock, if not disaster, if the minimum wage were significantly raised. A hardening of opposition, therefore, to the satisfaction of Negro needs must be anticipated as the movement presses against financial privilege. In that quote, there's nothing about a multiracial or interracial movement of working class people. You find that in other elements, right? But he's come to a vision of poverty that cannot be solved without redistributing resources. It's there in 1956 when he says, I have a dream that my children won't be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream of a country where resources are widely shared. I have a dream of a nation that will not take necessities from the masses to give luxuries to the classes. That's as frequent in his rhetoric as the content of their character speech. But yeah, this is a much more systemic appreciation of how intractable poverty was. As a result, he wanted to raise the minimum wage and reform the welfare and social security system to make it more universal and to guarantee a guaranteed annual income. So the slogan of the Poor People's March was jobs or income now.
And collective bargaining rights he believed in as well. Sorry to interject there. Sometimes my questions don't always hit the nail on the head.
The collective bargaining rights is really important to raise. Cleveland Robinson, his New York sort of advisor, was trying to get him involved in local labor struggles. He says, no, I have to go to Chicago and support this tenant union and fair housing movement. But the last act of his life is to respond to the call from James Lawson and the sanitation workers of Memphis to go. It's a public employees union. It is not recognized by the city, and its wages are not sufficient to feed a family. And so 3,000 go on strike against the city, and he goes there to support them. That is where he's assassinated.
Good evening. Dr. Martin Luther King, the apostle of nonviolence in the civil rights movement, has been shot to death in Memphis, Tennessee. Police have issued an all-points bulletin for a well-dressed young white man seen running from the scene.
In the effort to win both collective bargaining rights, but a decent annual income that you can live on.
Structural and systemic. Those were the words I was trying to key in on before when I was asking my question. So thank you for that. Yeah, sure. He saw government having a major role to play here in all this, and he did talk about redistribution of wealth. So government interventions in the private sector economy and redistribution, those types of ideas today get you called a socialist, as we know.
Yeah.
But I feel like many young people today are okay with those things.
Yes. There is a wide appreciation of something King said at the time, as early as 1961. The federal government, in coalition with local governments and privileged banks and developers, the federal government built ghettos. The federal government is deeply implicated in urban racial apartheid, and therefore the federal government has a responsibility to right those wrongs. He says most people are on welfare in one way or another in this country, but they call it subsidies or they call it Social Security. When it comes to the poor, they call it welfare and something that's illegitimate. So one of his most widely repeated phrases in the last 2 years of his life is, what we've got in this country is socialism for the rich and rugged free enterprise capitalism for poor people.
We are living in many ways in a socialist society right now. Problem is, as Dr. Martin Luther King reminded us, we have socialism for the very rich, rugged individualism for the poor.
Ira Katznelson wrote that the greatest piece of affirmative action ever passed in the United States was the GI Bill, college education and home mortgages.
Yeah.
As we know, African Americans were largely excluded from that legislation.
Sure. King goes all the way back, as does Ira, to the Homestead Act of 1862 and the failure to make real on the promise of land ownership for the newly emancipated Black working class, whereas white farmers and European immigrants got their 160 acres. And he said that's the beginning of this racial welfare state. The black folks are excluded from all of the benefits that have been directed toward opportunity.
It's not that people can't pull themselves up by their bootstraps.
Well, he used that metaphor all the time,
Yeah,
and he says, you can't expect a shoeless person to pull himself up by his bootstraps.
Yeah,
You need to have some basic needs met: health care, food, a stable community.
So we'll end with this, Thomas.
Okay.
Which king's speech would you suggest people listen to get the gist of what we've been discussing here? I mean, there's so many, but you can name one or two.
July 4th, 1965, a speech called The American Dream, where he says, "I've seen it turn into a nightmare, and we've got a march on poverty and slums." The New York City medallion speech, when he comes back from winning the Nobel Prize. Malcolm X is in the audience, and he says, "I like European social democracy. They don't have slums. They don't have mass hunger. They don't have, maybe we can move in their direction." That's 1964, a week after the war on poverty. 2 months after the war on poverty was passed. There are a lot of speeches, early ones. Paul's letter to American Christians, 1956. It goes into some of the moral corruptions of capitalism at the same time that it says we need to address poverty on a world level. He gets into a debate with Vice President Richard Nixon in 1959 about how damaging job discrimination is. He calls it murderous, and that's before a 400 religious assembly. So the Stanford University King Papers Project has a lot of these online. James Washington edited a thick volume of his speeches. There is a wonderful book edited by Michael Honey called All Labor Has Dignity, and it's a compendium of King's labor speeches calling for a labor coalition. There's a speech in there called The Unresolved Race Question. It's weeks after the March on Washington. He's speaking to 10,000 workers in Madison Square Garden, and he's saying basically everything that we've been talking about, that we've got to bring the arms race to an end. Vietnam is not yet really on the horizon. And we have to end hunger and give a job to every man who needs it. It's very gendered. The solution to poverty is to give the male breadwinner the means to support the family. But it's sort of all there in 1963.
And the events of 1963 will be the subject of Thomas Jackson's next book. The working title is Magnificent Militancy, Black Revolution, Mass Media, and the Processing of Civil Rights. Thomas Jackson, we thank you. On the next episode of History as It Happens, Henry Kissinger's 100th birthday is coming up. We're going to talk about his legacy, Kissinger and Cambodia. Next, as we report History as It Happens, a podcast from the Washington Times.